Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Black Pioneers of Science and Invention by Dr. Lewis Haber, narrated by Bill Andrew Quinn. Preface. This book deals with significant contributions made by black scientists and inventors who were pioneers in the various fields of science, and the roles they played in the development of scientific progress in the United States. Science textbooks and other books dealing with science contain little, if any, material dealing with these contributions. While references are often made to the work of George Washington Carver, information about such outstanding black scientists such as Benjamin Banneker, Dr. Charles R. Drew, Dr. Percy L. Julian, Dr. Ernest D. Just, and a host of others has not been available to most science teachers and their students. As a result, in classrooms across the nation, except for a few isolated instances, the contributions of black Americans to science and industry have been almost unknown. Although this book deals solely with the black scientists in the United States, reference should be made to the early progress of science in Africa. The ancient peoples living in the interior of Africa did not pass through a Bronze Age. Metals were abundant there, especially iron, and the Africans discovered the use of iron so early that they passed over the Bronze Age in going from the Stone to the Iron Age. Authorities in anthropology and archaeology concede that Africans were the first to discover iron, the element most useful to man. They learned how to extract iron from the ore that abounds in the interior of Africa and to refine it in furnaces, and blacksmiths throughout Africa worked the metal into useful tools. Other peoples learned to use iron only much later. In Africa, the black was a discoverer and inventor in spite of his lack of contact with the so-called progressive parts of Asia and Europe. Scientists now give Africans credit for first discovering iron, developing stringed instruments, domesticating the sheep, goat, and cow, and learning about the planetary system. When the black man was brought to the United States and enslaved, all his wits were needed for attempts to make his lot easier in bondage and to obtain his freedom in the face of many obstacles. Yet even while he was engaged in this urgent effort, he succeeded in making a contribution to American invention. The vast majority of blacks in 1870 were illiterate because they had not been allowed to go to school. In fact, most of the southern states during slavery had laws prohibiting anyone from teaching slaves to read and write. It is against this background of educational deprivation that the achievements of the black scientist and inventor can be seen in sharpest perspective. The author began research into this area many years ago. His objective was to gather resource materials that could then be incorporated into science curricula at elementary and secondary schools as well as at the college level. In 1966, he was given a grant from the U.S. Office of Education to pursue this study. After 3 more years of research, the materials were incorporated into this book. The Schomburg collection of the New York Public Library was an excellent source of information and documentation, and the author is indebted to its cooperative staff. The Library of Congress and the National Archives in Washington, D.C., provided much of the primary source material, as well as the Moreland Collection at Howard University in Washington. Benjamin Banneker, 1731 to 1806. At a time when President George Washington and Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson were discouraged and felt that their plans for a new capital of the country were doomed to failure, a black surveyor stepped forward and saved the situation. It was through his remarkable talents that the city of Washington, D.C. was finally laid out and completed. Outstanding astronomer, mathematician, and surveyor, this was Benjamin Banneker of colonial times. Born on a farm outside Baltimore, Maryland in 1731, Banneker had a most unusual background. The women of his family were of unusual stock. His mother was a free woman, while his father was a slave. His grandmother, Molly Walsh, a white Englishwoman, had been a dairymaid in England. The story is that on a cold, gray morning in 1698, a cow kicked over a pail of milk and the frightened dairymaid fell off her stool. Molly was brought into court and accused of stealing the milk. The court did not believe her account of what happened, and she was convicted. She was sentenced to serve 7 years of bondage in the faraway colony of Maryland. When Molly had served out her sentence in Maryland and secured her freedom, the first thing she did was to go west and stake out some land for a farm. In those days it was possible to acquire land in that way, although it was extraordinary for a woman to do so, especially by herself. But then Molly Walsh was no ordinary woman. After obtaining the land, she went back to the coast and purchased 2 male Africans from a slave ship. She married one of the slaves, who was to become Benjamin's grandfather. Molly and her husband worked on their farm and by dint of great effort and wise planning made it very successful and productive. They raised mainly tobacco and used their product to buy more land. Her husband, Banneker, later changed to Banneker, was of royal African blood, and he brought with him much of the African culture and agricultural knowledge. This included the art of irrigation, and when neighboring farms suffered from lack of rain, losing their crops as a result, the Banneker farm flourished and prospered. Young Banneker would watch as his grandfather diverted a nearby stream by means of cleverly built canals onto the regular rows of tobacco plants. Their farm was the envy of the neighbors. In time a child was born, a girl, who was named Mary. By the Act of 1681, children born of white servant women and Negroes were free. Mary, daughter of Banneker and Molly Walsh, was a free mulatto. When the time came for Mary to marry, she did the same as her mother had done. She purchased a slave and married him. The product of this marriage was Benjamin Banneker. Being born of a free mother, Benjamin was also free. When Banneker was 12 years old, a Quaker by the name of Peter Heinrich moved into the valley next to the Banneker farm. Heinrich was to have a profound effect on the young lad, who eventually took over many of the customs and thinking of Quakers, even in dress. When Heinrich opened a school for all boys, young Banneker was allowed to enroll, despite the raised eyebrows of many in the white community. He showed particular interest and a tremendous ability in mathematics and soon progressed beyond the ability of his teacher. As Banneker grew up, he diligently performed his chores on the farm while his interest in mathematics deepened. He would make up mathematical problems and then solve them. One day, on a trip to the coast to sell the farm's tobacco crop, he met a fascinating man by the name of Joseph Levi. Levi showed him a pocket watch, something Banneker had never seen or heard of. Levi explained how it worked, and when he saw how excited Banneker became, he gave him the watch. Needless to say, Banneker took the watch home and spent days taking it apart and putting it together again until he became thoroughly familiar with the way it worked. Why not make one himself? Off he went to his old teacher, Heinrich, for advice and help. Heinrich wasn't much help, but he did give Banneker some material to guide him. An old journal from London that had a picture of a clock, a book on geometry, and Isaac Newton's Principia, laws of motion. Armed with these materials, Banneker proceeded to draw plans for a clock, using compass and ruler for measurements, with the picture and the watch as models. He also made the mathematical calculations necessary to make the parts. For 2 years, Banneker spent all his spare time working on the clock. He built it entirely of wood and carved each of the gears by hand. By 1753, it was completed. It was the first clock ever built in the United States. The clock kept perfect time, striking every hour for more than 40 years. People came from all over the country to see his clock. It created a sensation. When he was 28 years old, Banneker came as close to marriage as he would ever come. He fell in love with Enola, a pretty slave on a nearby plantation. When Enola's master refused to sell her to Banneker, Banneker planned to steal her away and actually booked passage for the two of them on a boat going to England. The plan failed, however, and Banneker was nearly killed in the process. Broken-hearted, Enola committed suicide by drowning. Faithful to her memory, Banneker never married. In 1772, Andrew Ellicott and his 3 sons came to the area to build a mill. Banneker and the Ellicotts were to become lifelong friends, working with each other to mutual advantage. This tobacco country seemed a strange place for a mill, but Ellicott felt that tobacco was spoiling the land, taking too much out of the soil. He got the farmers to grow wheat instead. Banneker, 41 years old at that time, helped the Ellicotts with his knowledge of mechanics and put together the machinery for the mill. By 1774, 2 years later, a small village called Ellicott's Mill had been laid out. With the coming of the Revolutionary War, wheat became very important as a source of food. When the Third Continental Congress met in Philadelphia in 1776, Banneker traveled there by horse. There Thomas Jefferson submitted his Declaration of Independence, which stated in part that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Later, Banneker was to remind Jefferson of these wonderful words. With the Declaration of Independence, the war began. Banneker was so imbued with the spirit he found in Philadelphia that he returned home and planted wheat to feed the Revolutionary Army. He did much to raise food in that whole area for Washington's men, who needed it badly. During the war, Andrew Ellicott died and left Banneker some books on astronomy and some scientific instruments, including a telescope. Banneker began to study astronomy in earnest and undertook mathematical calculations relating to the stars and the constellations. Based upon his calculations, he predicted that a solar eclipse would take place on April 14, 1789. This was in contradiction to the predictions of 2 eminent mathematicians and leading astronomers of that time, Leadbetter and Ferguson. Banneker showed where these men had made errors in their calculations, and the eclipse took place just as he had predicted. Because of his great interest in astronomy and mathematics, Banneker prepared an almanac in 1792 and another each year thereafter for 10 years. It included the times of eclipses, the hours of sunrise and sunset, weather forecasts for the year, a tide table for Chesapeake Bay, festival days, holidays, phases of the moon, and so on. His almanac was widely read in the Middle States in the 1790s and was circulated in Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia. It became a household staple in early America along with the Bible. Unlike Benjamin Franklin's almanac, for which much of the work was not done by Franklin, all the calculations in Banneker's almanac were made by Banneker himself. He even included a list of medicines to help ward off diseases. Banneker was deeply concerned over the plight of the Negro slaves and printed a good deal of anti-slavery material in his almanacs and elsewhere. When he sent a handwritten copy of his first almanac to Thomas Jefferson, then Secretary of State under Washington, he took the opportunity to accompany the almanac with a 12-page letter in which he defended the mental capacities of the Negro and challenged Jefferson's integrity in the treatment of blacks. Jefferson, a slaveholder himself, had written earlier that the blacks are inferior to the whites in the endowments both of body and mind. Here, in part, is what Banneker wrote to Jefferson. One universal Father hath given being to us all, and he hath not only made us all of one flesh, but he hath also, without partiality, afforded us all the same sensations and endowed us all with the same faculties. And that however variable we may be in society or religion, however diversified in situation or color, we are all in the same family and stand in the same relation to him. It is the indispensable duty of those who maintain for themselves the rights of human nature and who possess the obligations of Christianity to extend their power and influence to the relief of every part of the human race, from whatever burden or oppression they may unjustly labor under. I freely and cheerfully acknowledge that I am of the African race, and in that color which is natural to them of the deepest dye. And it is under a sense of the most profound gratitude to the Supreme Ruler of the universe that I now confess to you that I am not under that state of tyrannical thraldom and inhuman captivity to which too many of my brethren are doomed, but that I have abundantly tasted of the fruition of those blessings which proceed from that free and unequaled liberty with which you are favored, and which, I hope, you will willingly allow you have mercifully received from the immediate hand of that Being from whom proceedeth every good and perfect gift. Suffer me to recall to your mind that time in which the arms and tyranny of the British Crown were exerted with every powerful effort in order to reduce you to a state of servitude. This, sir, was a time when you clearly saw into the injustice of a state of slavery, and in which you had just apprehensions of the horrors of its condition. It was now that your abhorrence thereof was so excited that you publicly held forth this true and invaluable doctrine, which is worthy to be recorded and remembered in all succeeding ages. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Sir, how pitiable it is to reflect that although you were so fully convinced of the benevolence of the Father of mankind, and of his equal and impartial distribution of these rights and privileges which he hath conferred upon them, that you should at the same time counteract his mercies in detaining by fraud and violence so numerous a part of my brethren under groaning captivity and cruel oppression, that you should at the same time be found guilty of that most criminal act which you professedly detested in others with respect to yourselves. This was a bold, courageous, and challenging letter. In it, Banneker accused Jefferson of guilt as a slaveholder and of having double standards when he wrote, "All men are created equal," and that they are entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These fine words, said Banneker, should apply to all men, black as well as white. A reply from Jefferson came 11 days later. I thank you sincerely for your letter of the 19th instant. Nobody wishes more than I do to see such proofs as you exhibit, that nature has given to our black brethren talents equal to those of the other colors of men, and that the appearance of the want of them is owing merely to the degraded condition of their existence both in Africa and America. I can add with truth that nobody wishes more ardently to see a good system commenced for raising the condition, both of their body and mind, to what it ought to be, as far as the imbecility of their present existence and other circumstances, which cannot be neglected, will admit. I have taken the liberty of sending your almanac to Monsieur de Condorcet, Secretary of the Academy of Sciences at Paris, because I considered it as a document to which your whole color has a right for their justification, against the doubts which have been entertained of them. I am, with great esteem, sir, your most obedient, humble servant, Thomas Jefferson, Philadelphia, August 30th, 1791. These letters were part of a long correspondence between Jefferson and Banneker concerning the mental capacities of the Negro and the whole question of slavery. Banneker's almanacs became almost as famous as his clock. In A Tribute for the Negro, published in Manchester, England, Armistead Wilson said of the almanac, "These calculations were so thorough and exact as to excite the approbation of Pitt, Fox, and Wilberforce." One of his almanacs was produced in the British House of Commons as an argument in favor of the mental cultivation of colored people. In a preface to Banneker's Almanac and Ephemeris of 1796, the fifth almanac to be issued, the white editor said, "To whom do you think you are indebted for this entertainment? Why, to a black man. Strange! Is a black capable of compiling an almanac? Indeed, it is no less strange than true, and a clever, wise, long-headed black he is. The labors of the justly celebrated Banneker will likewise furnish you with a very important lesson, courteous listener, which you will not find in any other almanac, namely, that the Maker of the universe is no respecter of colors, that the color of the skin is no way connected with the strength of mind or intellectual powers, that although the God of nature has marked the face of the African with a darker hue than his brethren, he has given him a soul equally capable of refinement. In a letter dated August 20th, 1791, James McHenry, a prominent Marylander who later served as Secretary of War in Washington's cabinet, made these references to Banneker. I consider this Negro as fresh proof that the powers of the mind are disconnected with the color of the skin, or, in other words, a striking contradiction of Mr. Hume's doctrine that the Negroes are naturally inferior to the whites and unsusceptible of attainments in arts and sciences. At about the time that Banneker began working on his almanac, President Washington had decided to move the capital of the country from Philadelphia to a new location that was to be called Washington. He appointed Major Pierre Charles Lafont, a young Frenchman who had served with the Continental Army in the Corps of Engineers, to be in charge of building the new city. Major Andrew Ellicott, one of the Ellicott boys, was named chief surveyor. At Jefferson's request, Banneker was appointed as the third member of his team. The assignment was to define the boundaries of the new city and then design and lay out its streets and major buildings. Banneker worked closely with L'Enfant and his maps. But the bureaucrats of that day did not take kindly to a foreigner being given so much power and authority, and they interfered in many frustrating ways. This resulted in the highly sensitive and hot-tempered L'Enfant resigning his position and returning to France, taking all the plans and maps with him. Everybody was dismayed, and Jefferson called a meeting of the men involved. What was to be done? Start all over again after more than a year's work? Despair and frustration showed on their faces. Suddenly Banneker asked, "Did you like the plans that were made?" All eyes turned to him. "Of course, but we don't have them." "I think I can reproduce them from memory," said Banneker. The men were astounded and somewhat skeptical. Banneker then went home and, because of his remarkable memory, was able to reproduce all the plans in 2 days. The work of laying out the city of Washington, with its streets and major buildings, was completed and stands today as a monument to Banneker's genius. Besides speaking out boldly against the institution of slavery, Banneker was strongly opposed to war. In his almanac for 1792, he proposed the establishment of a Department of Peace within the executive branch of the government with a Secretary of Peace instead of a Secretary of War. His plan included a proposal for free schools for all children and the abolition of capital punishment. Plan of a Peace Officer for the United States. Among the many defects which have been pointed out in the Federal Constitution, it is much to be lamented that no person has taken notice of its total silence upon the subject of an office of the utmost importance to the welfare of the United States, that is, an office for promoting and preserving perpetual peace in our country. The plan presented 7 proposals. 1. Let a Secretary of Peace be appointed to preside in this office. 2. Let a power be given to this Secretary to establish and maintain free schools in every city, village, and township of the United States, and let him be made responsible for the talents, principles, and morals of all his schoolmasters. 3. Let every family in the United States be furnished at the public expense by the Secretary of this office with a copy of an American edition of the Bible. 4. Let this sentence be inscribed in letters of gold over the door of every home in the United States: The Son of Man came into the world, not to destroy men's lives, but to save them. 5. To inspire a veneration for human life and an horror at the shedding of human blood, let all those laws be repealed which authorize juries, judges, sheriffs, or hangmen to assume the resentments of individuals and to commit murder in cold blood in any case whatever. 6. To subdue that passion for war which education, added to human depravity, has made universal, a familiarity with the instruments of death as well as all military shows should be carefully avoided. Military dress and military titles laid aside. 7. Let a large room adjoining the Federal Hall be appointed for transacting the business and preserving all the records of this office. Over the door of this room let there be a sign, on which the figures of a lamb, a dove, and an olive branch should be painted, together with this inscription in letters of gold: Peace on earth, goodwill to man. Ah, why will men forget that they are brethren? Banneker spent the later years of his life in retirement on his farm, where he entertained many distinguished men of science and art. They came from all over the world to meet this remarkable scientist, astronomer, mathematician, clockmaker, and surveyor. On October 25, 1806, Banneker died. The Federal Gazette and Baltimore Daily Advertiser of October 28, 1806, carried a notice saying, "Known in this neighborhood for his quiet and peaceful demeanor, and, among scientists, as an astronomer and mathematician." In his will, Banneker left a number of scientific instruments and many books, as well as a large volume of his manuscripts, to one of the Ellicott boys, George Ellicott. The volume included Banneker's observations on various subjects and copies of all his almanacs, as well as copies of his letters to Thomas Jefferson. All of this is now on display at the Maryland Historical Society. In France, the Marquis du Condorcet lauded him before the Academy of Sciences. In England, William Pitt placed his name in the records of the Parliament. To the writer's knowledge, no memorial or tablet was erected in this country, nor official recognition given to Banneker's tremendous contributions. Norbert Rioux, 1806 to 1894. Very few inventions can be said to be of worldwide significance. It is generally recognized, however, that Norbert Rieux's invention of the vacuum pan evaporator revolutionized the world's sugar industry. The familiar white refined crystals of sugar that we take for granted today were made possible by this black man's genius. What is the story of this remarkable inventor? On March 17, 1806, a child was born on a New Orleans plantation. The child's father was the master of the plantation, a wealthy Frenchman and engineer. His mother was a slave on the plantation. That child was Norbert Rioux. His birth record, now on file in the city of New Orleans, lists Norbert Rioux, quadroon libre, natural son of Vincent Rioux and Constance Vivant, born March 17, 1806. Baptized in St. Louis Cathedral by Père Antoine. In his work as an engineer, Rieux's father was the inventor of a steam-operated cotton baling press. Young Norbert's extraordinary ability became apparent at an early age, and his father sent him to Paris to be educated. This, no doubt, was dictated by the lack of opportunity for a proper education for him in New Orleans, where educational opportunities for Negroes, free or slave, were unknown. It should be pointed out here that young Rieux's experience was unlike that of other blacks of his time. He was a free man and was always in a well-to-do and cultured environment because of his father's position and wealth. In Paris, Norbert turned out to be a brilliant student at l'École Centrale. He showed an extraordinary aptitude for engineering, and at the age of 24 became an instructor of applied mechanics at l'École Centrale. In 1830 he published a series of papers on steam engine work and steam economy that created favorable attention in scientific circles all over Europe. He also developed the theory of multiple effect evaporation that was to be the basis for his precedent-shattering invention. Perhaps Rieux's interest in the sugar refining process stemmed from his memory of seeing gangs of sweating slaves in New Orleans painfully pouring and ladling boiling sugarcane juice from one steaming open kettle to another. Until 1846, the transformation of sugarcane juice into sugar was accomplished by this primitive method known as the Jamaica train, a slow and costly process. Although man had finally learned to make sugar from the juice of sugarcane and later from beets, the only sugar available from the Jamaica train process was in dark, crude form, sometimes so crude as to look like molasses. What was needed was some way to refine and granulate sugar, so as to produce it with the same sweetness but without the crude effects. This was the task that Ryu set out to accomplish. Sugar is easily affected by heat and...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?